The gavel came down on the courthouse steps of Ridgeback Flats, and old Gray Hawk did not flinch, though the crowd around him surged forward like a single hungry animal. Sheriff Dunmore held up a hand for quiet that never came. Someone in the back threw a rock. It struck the old Apache man's shoulder, and still he did not lower his eyes. Amos Whitlock stood at the edge of that crowd with his hat pulled low, watching a town he had known his whole life turn into something he no longer recognized, and he understood, in that single suspended second, that he was about to do something that would cost him everything he had left. Gray Hawk had been dragged from his camp 3 miles outside town after the Delacroix mill burned to the ground 2 nights before, taking with it the town's only source of flour before winter. Nobody had found him near the fire. Nobody had a single witness. But he was the last of his people still living anywhere near Ridgeback Flats, and that alone had been evidence enough for a jury that had already decided his guilt before the trial began. The sentence was banishment, walk out past the county line by sundown, and never come back, or hang for it. String him up now and save the walk, a voice called from the crowd, and a ripple of ugly laughter followed it. Gray Hawk's hands were bound at the wrists with rough rope, his back straight despite 2 nights in a cell with no blanket. He looked out over the crowd once, slow and steady, the way a man looks at something he has already made peace with, and said nothing at all. His silence unsettled the crowd more than any plea for mercy could have. Amos had grown up 2 farms down from the mill that burned. He knew every hand that had worked that building, knew the timber was old and dry as kindling, knew the foreman had been complaining about a faulty stove flue for a month before the fire ever started. Nobody in that crowd wanted to hear it. They wanted someone to blame, and blame had found the easiest target in the county. The deputies untied Gray Hawk's hands only long enough to march him toward the county line road, the whole town trailing behind like a funeral procession that hadn't bothered to grieve. Amos watched the old man's bare feet. His boots had been taken as a fine, cross gravel and broken glass without a single sound of pain leaving his mouth, and something in Amos's chest went tight and hot and furious all at once. He stepped out of the crowd before he'd decided to. "This man didn't burn that mill," Amos said, loud enough that the whole street heard it. The crowd turned on him like a single creature waking up. Sheriff Dunmore's eyes narrowed. "You got proof of that, Whitlock, or just a fondness for troublemakers?" Amos didn't have proof. Not yet. What he had was 3 years of watching this town look for someone to hate, and a certainty settling cold and absolute in his gut that he would not stand by and watch it happen again. "I've got eyes," Amos said. "And eyes tell me a man who spent 2 nights freezing in your jail for a fire nobody saw him start doesn't deserve to walk out of this county barefoot." The crowd murmured, uneasy, some faces turning away from him already. Gray Hawk, still bound, turned his head just slightly toward the young man who had stepped forward for him, the first person in 2 days to speak a single word in his defense, and in that look was a question neither of them yet knew the answer to. What would this cost him? Sheriff Dunmore spat into the dirt near Amos's boots. "Banishment stands. Court spoken." He gave a short nod, and the deputies pushed Gray Hawk forward again, toward the tree line where the county road disappeared west into open, unforgiving country. Amos looked at the old man's bleeding feet, at the crowd already losing interest and drifting back toward their suppers, and made the only decision his conscience would allow. He walked straight past the deputies, pulled his own boots off his feet, and set them down in front of Gray Hawk without a word. Nobody in the crowd moved for a long moment. A man giving up his own boots for a condemned stranger was not something Ridgeback Flats had a ready response for. Sheriff Dunmore's jaw worked like he wanted to object, but there was no law against a fool giving away his footwear, and he knew it. Gray Hawk looked down at the boots, then up at Amos, and for the first time since his arrest, something shifted behind his eyes, not gratitude exactly, but recognition, as if he were looking at a kind of person he'd stopped expecting to find. Amos walked Gray Hawk himself as far as the county line, ignoring the whispers that trailed them the whole way. When they reached the marker post at the edge of Ridgeback territory, Gray Hawk stopped and studied the young man beside him, barefoot now on cold autumn ground. "You did not have to do this," the old man said, his voice low and rough from 2 nights of cold and silence. Amos shrugged like it cost him nothing, though every step on the frozen road told him otherwise. "Didn't have to," he agreed. "Wanted to." Gray Hawk did not walk on past the marker. Instead he sat down on a fallen log just inside the line, and Amos, against every ounce of good sense, sat down beside him. They stayed there past dusk, saying little, until Amos finally offered what he had, a small line shack he kept a half-mile off his father's property, meant for storing tools, barely big enough for one man to sleep in. Gray Hawk accepted with a single nod, and that was how it began. Amos had lost his mother to fever 6 years back and his older brother to a stampede the following spring, and since then his father had gone quiet in a way that never fully lifted, leaving Amos to run most of the ranch alone at 22 years old with barely a word exchanged over supper most nights. He had learned to work through loneliness rather than speak of it, the same way a man learns to work through a bad knee, carefully, and without complaint. Gray Hawk, watching him haul water and mend fence in near silence those first mornings, recognized the shape of that particular kind of grief immediately, having carried a version of it himself for far longer than Amos had been alive. Gray Hawk had once had a wife and 2 daughters, taken one by one, the youngest to a winter fever, the eldest to a raid neither side of the conflict claimed responsibility for, and his wife to grief itself, the kind that simply stops a heart when there is nothing left for it to hold on to. He had wandered the territory for 11 years since, working where work was allowed, moving on before anyone could decide he didn't belong. Ridgeback Flats had simply been the town where his luck ran out. He did not tell Amos all of this at once. He told it in pieces, over weeks, the way a man reveals an old wound only once he trusts the hands that might touch it. One cold morning, mending a length of fence that had sagged for a season because Amos's father no longer had the will to fix it, Gray Hawk paused and ran his weathered hand along a section of wire pulled too tight. "A fence stretched too tight breaks first storm that comes," he said, testing the tension with 2 fingers. "Leave it room to move, and it holds through anything." Amos glanced at him, sensing there was more in the words than fence wire, but said nothing yet, only filed the sentence away the way a man files away something he knows he'll need later. By the second week, the 2 of them had built a rhythm neither had realized he was starving for: coffee before first light, work through the cold months settling in, and quiet conversation by a small stove in the line shack once the sun went down. Amos found himself talking more in those 2 weeks than he had in the 2 years since his brother died. Gray Hawk listened the way few people ever had, without rushing to fill every silence, and Amos began to understand that this was its own kind of gift. But Ridgeback Flats was a small town, and small towns do not forget easily, and by the 3rd week, word had reached every porch and pew that Amos Whitlock was harboring the very man the court had banished. Amos's father noticed too, though he said little about it at first, only watching his son come in later each evening with a stillness that unsettled Amos more than shouting would have. One night, over a supper eaten mostly in silence, his father finally spoke. "That banished man staying in the line shack." Amos didn't deny it. His father set down his fork, studied his son for a long moment, and to Amos's surprise, only nodded once, slow and heavy, before returning to his meal. It was not approval, not exactly, but it was not the refusal Amos had braced for either, and in a house that had gone quiet with grief for 6 years, that small unspoken permission meant more than words could have carried. The general store began running short of feed whenever Amos came to buy it, though the shelves stayed full for every other rancher in the county. The blacksmith suddenly had no time to shoe Amos's horses, no matter how far in advance he asked. Small cruelties, each one deniable on its own, stacking up into something unmistakable the moment you stepped back and looked at the whole of it. Amos said nothing about any of it to Gray Hawk. He simply rode further each week to find what he needed, and came home each night as if nothing at all had changed. Gray Hawk noticed anyway. He always noticed. One evening he set down the harness he'd been repairing and told Amos plainly that he intended to move on before the trouble grew worse, that he would not be the reason a good man lost his father's ranch. Amos's answer came fast and hard. "You go now," he said, "and every one of them gets exactly what they wanted." Grey Hawk studied him a long moment, searching his face for doubt and finding none. "You barely know me," the old man said quietly. Amos held his gaze. "Know enough." Sheriff Dunmore rode out to the Whitlock Ranch himself the following week, 2 deputies flanking him, dust rising behind their horses like a warning. He didn't dismount. "Court banished that Apache," he said, voice flat and final. "You're harboring a fugitive from this county, Whitlock, and that's a fact the judge won't overlook twice." Amos stood on his own porch, arms crossed, boots, borrowed from his father now, planted wide. "He's not hiding," Amos said. "He's working my land, same as any hired hand. You've got no law against that." Dunmore's horse shifted under him, impatient. "One more incident," the sheriff said, "and I stop being patient with you both." He turned his horse and rode off without waiting for a reply, and Amos understood the warning for exactly what it was. That night, Grey Hawk found Amos sitting outside the line shack long after dark, staring at nothing in particular. "You should let this go," Amos said, not looking up. "Let me take whatever comes and you go on somewhere they won't hunt you." Grey Hawk lowered himself onto the step beside him, slow with age and the cold in his joints. "A man who runs every time trouble finds him," he said, "never learns the trouble was never truly about him at all." Amos turned that thought over for a long while, saying nothing, the two of them sitting together under a sky gone hard and bright with early winter stars. Through the growing pressure, Grey Hawk kept teaching, as if the lessons themselves were a kind of quiet defiance. He showed Amos an old dry wash cutting through the northern edge of the ranch, one Amos had ridden past his entire life without a second thought. Grey Hawk crouched at its edge, running weathered fingers over cracked, sun-hardened earth. "Water remembers its path," he said. "Even years dry, it does not forget the way home." Amos didn't understand the full weight of the words yet, only nodded, and helped the old man back to his feet. By early winter, a hard freeze settled over the whole county earlier than anyone could remember, locking wells shut under thick ice and leaving cattle bawling for water they couldn't reach. Barns that had stood full through every winter in living memory now held animals growing gaunt within days, and ranchers who had never once needed to worry about water began riding from farm to farm, comparing notes on wells none of them could crack. Ridgeback Flats, the very town that had banished the one man who understood this land better than anyone alive, now faced a crisis none of its pride or prejudice could solve alone. At church that following Sunday, the pews on either side of Amos's family stayed conspicuously empty, though the small building was otherwise full to the walls. Amos sat through the whole service with his father beside him, feeling the weight of every glance that slid away the moment he looked back. His father, for the first time in 6 years, sat up straight through the entire sermon instead of staring blankly at his own hands, as though some old stubbornness in him had finally found a reason to wake up again. Even Amos's oldest friend, a rancher's son named Tobias who had grown up on the neighboring spread, stopped riding over on Sunday afternoons the way he had for a decade. When Amos finally rode out to ask him why, Tobias wouldn't meet his eyes. "My pa says associating with you is bad for the family name now," Tobias said, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. Amos studied his old friend for a long moment, feeling something quietly close between them that had taken 20 years to build. "Didn't figure you'd let your pa do your thinking for you," Amos said, and rode off before Tobias could answer, the loss of it settling heavier than he expected. The Ridgeback Flats town well froze solid on a Monday, and by Wednesday even Sheriff Dunmore's own herd had begun dropping in the frozen pastures behind his house. Amos rode into town that morning for supplies and found the well house surrounded by a crowd of the same people who had thrown rocks at Grey Hawk 2 months before, now staring helplessly at a sheet of ice they had no idea how to break through, panic replacing the pride that had cost them their only source of local knowledge. Amos thought of the dry wash on the northern edge of his ranch, of Grey Hawk's weathered hand against cracked earth, of words about water remembering its way home that he hadn't fully understood until this exact moment. He rode back hard, boots, his father's now, given without a word one cold morning, pounding the frozen ground, and found Grey Hawk mending a saddle strap outside the line shack. He didn't ask for help outright. He simply told him what was happening in town, and let the old man decide for himself what, if anything, he owed a place that had tried to kill him for a fire he never started. Grey Hawk set down the strap slowly, memory moving plain and heavy across his face. 2 nights in a cold cell, a barefoot walk to a county line, a wife and 2 daughters lost to a world that had never once tried to understand his people before condemning them. They didn't ask before, he said finally, voice low. Doesn't mean I stop being who I am. He reached for the coat Amos had given him weeks before and stood, and Amos felt something settle in his chest that he would carry the rest of his life, the sight of a man choosing decency after everything decency had cost him. They rode into Ridgeback Flats together, back through the same street that had marched Grey Hawk out barefoot in autumn. The crowd at the well house fell silent as they approached, uncertain what they were seeing. Sheriff Dunmore stepped forward, jaw tight, pride and desperation warring openly on his face. "You've got no reason to help this town," he said. Grey Hawk met his eyes without flinching. "Never needed a reason to be decent," he said. "Only you did." He led them a quarter-mile east, to a shallow basin beneath a stand of bare cottonwoods that every rancher in the county had ridden past 100 times without a second glance. He knelt in the frozen ground, breaking through crusted ice and packed earth with a hand shovel. Amos passed him, working in silence while the whole town watched. Beneath 18 inches of frozen soil, the ground turned dark, then damp, then wet, an underground spring fed by mountain runoff that never froze even in the hardest winters, knowledge carried by his people across this land for longer than Ridgeback Flats had existed at all. Water began seeping up through the broken earth, and a child near the front dropped to her knees, pressing small hands into the cold mud just to feel it, laughing despite the freezing air. Sheriff Dunmore stood over the spring with his hat in his hands, something in his hard, weathered face finally cracking open. 2 months I let a fire I never proved stand against you, he said quietly, the words costing him visibly. Every door this town shut on you, mine included. I'm sorry for it. Grey Hawk only nodded, no bitterness left in his expression, only the quiet, hard-won weight of finally being seen for exactly who he was. By the time the town had dug the new well wide enough to serve every ranch in the county, dusk had settled cold and clear over Ridgeback Flats, and for the first time since the fire, the crowd gathered there looked at Grey Hawk not with suspicion, but with something dangerously close to shame giving way to gratitude. Tobias pushed his way through the crowd toward Amos, hat in hand, something raw and apologetic in his expression. Should have stood with you from the start, he said, low enough that only Amos could hear it. Amos looked at his old friend for a long moment, weighing the weeks of silence between them against the years before it, and finally extended his hand. Took you long enough, Amos said, but there was no real edge left in it, only the tired relief of a friendship finding its footing again. Amos's father rode into town late that evening, having heard what happened from a neighbor passing on the road, and found his son standing beside Grey Hawk near the new well, both of them soaked and half-frozen and quietly proud. He dismounted slowly, walked straight up to Grey Hawk, and extended a hand that had shaken very little in the 6 years since his wife's death. My boy's got better judgment than most grown men in this county, he said. Reckon he gets that from somewhere. Grey Hawk shook the offered hand firmly, and something passed between the 2 older men that needed no further explanation, one father recognizing, in a stranger, the kind of steadiness he had once feared he'd lost forever. By the following spring, the dry wash on the northern edge of the Whitlock Ranch ran full for the first time in a decade, exactly as Grey Hawk had promised it would the day he first knelt beside its cracked, forgotten bed. He never went back to wandering. Ridgeback Flats, the town that had once marched him barefoot to its border, helped raise a small cabin for him that spring on a corner of the Whitlock land, and the door to it was never once shut against him again. Sheriff Dunmore himself came out to help lift the roof beam, working in near silence beside the man he had once escorted to exile, a debt neither of them ever spoke aloud because neither needed to. Tobias rode over most Sundays again, and Amos's father, 6 years quiet, had somehow found his voice again sitting on Grey Hawk's porch some evenings, the two old men trading stories neither had told another living soul in years. Children in Ridgeback Flats grew up knowing Grey Hawk not as the man once blamed for a fire he never set, but as the man who found water beneath frozen ground when the whole county had none left to give. Some of them, years later, would still walk out to the old dry wash just to hear him tell the story of the winter the well froze solid, though by then the tale had softened at its edges the way old wounds do once they've finally been allowed to heal. And Amos, watching his own children play years later near that same dry wash, now a steady, living creek that never ran dry again, not even in the driest summers that followed, often thought back to a line spoken beside cracked, sun-hardened earth on a cold morning long ago, that water remembers its way home, no matter how many dry years pass in between. He understood, finally and completely, that the same was true of people, that the smallest act of decency, once given, never truly disappears. It waits, patient as a spring beneath frozen ground, for someone brave enough to dig, and for someone honest enough to be found. If you were standing in Amos's boots that day outside the courthouse, would you have stepped forward for a stranger the whole town had already condemned?